The morning Gerald Adkins called to confirm the reading, Naomi Whitfield was standing in the kitchen of the house she had grown up in, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold while she was not paying attention to it. Outside the window, the maple her father had planted the year she was born was doing what maples do in November, releasing its leaves one at a time. No hurry, no ceremony. He had always loved that tree. He called it proof that something could be beautiful and practical at the same time. It gave shade in summer and its leaves broke down by spring, and it asked very little of anyone in the meantime. She had not been able to look at it since he died without hearing his voice. Her stepmother Diane was still upstairs. Naomi could hear her moving across the floor of the master bedroom. The particular sound of heels on hardwood that Diane had brought into this house, along with her silk throw pillows and her opinions about the kitchen renovation. Diane wore heels for everything. She had worn them to Thomas Whitfield's funeral 14 days ago, black ones with a small gold buckle at the ankle, and Naomi had noticed this the way she had been noticing things about Diane for 7 years, with the careful and involuntary attention of a person who has learned to read a room by reading one person in it very closely. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Gerald had said he would arrive at 10. It was 8:52. Naomi had been awake since 4:45. She had not slept much in the 3 weeks since the hospital called. She was 31 years old, and she had driven 3 hours north from Savannah and had been in this house, in her old room, ever since. People had been coming and going for a week after the funeral and had stopped coming, which was how funerals worked, and now the house was quiet in the way of a house that has lost its organizing person. She was waiting for Gerald Adkins, and she was watching the maple, and she had her phone in the pocket of her apron, and she had been thinking since 5 in the morning about what was going to happen at 10. Her father's name was Thomas Everett Whitfield. He was 63 years old when he died, on a Thursday morning in March that had done nothing to signal it was coming. The sky clear, the light already warming towards spring. He had been a man who fixed things with his hands before he called anyone else to fix them, who kept a legal pad by his recliner and wrote down his thoughts as they came to him, who made excellent chili and mediocre biscuits and was the first person to tell you which was which. He had run Whitfield Building Supply in Carver, Georgia for 31 years, the same business his father had opened in 1967 in a building 2 blocks from where it now stood, a building that had grown 3 times since then and employed 42 people and had the quality of a local institution, the kind of place that people in Carver used without thinking about it, the way you use roads and do not consider them until someone mentions they might be changed. He had his first stroke on the 3rd of October, 2 years before he died. It was a Wednesday. Naomi had been in Savannah in the middle of a conference call when her cell phone buzzed on the table beside her laptop, screen down, and she had flipped it over and seen her Aunt Ruth's name and understood, before she answered, that something had happened. She had been right. She drove those 3 hours without stopping, arriving at Carver General at 8:20 in the evening to find Ruth Whitfield in the family waiting room with a styrofoam cup of coffee and the stillness of a woman who has been holding herself together for several hours and intends to keep doing it. Ruth was Thomas's younger sister by 4 years, and she had a quality Naomi had been grateful for her whole life and had never quite been able to explain. She was somehow already there when you arrived at the hard things. You walked in and she was there and you were not alone, and that was the whole of it. He's stable, Ruth had said. They caught it early enough. But they need to run tests. Naomi had sat beside her and taken the coffee and drunk it even though it was terrible, because her body needed something to do with its hands. They had sat together for 2 more hours while the doctors came out in intervals with the calibrated language of people conveying complicated information to families who may or may not be able to hold the weight of it. Diane had arrived at 9:40. She had been at a charity dinner in Atlanta when the hospital called, which was 80 miles away, and she had come through the sliding glass doors in the dress and the heels she had not stopped to change. She embraced Naomi briefly, went directly to the nurse's station. This was how Diane operated in most situations, moving with purpose toward whoever held the most institutional authority in the room. It was not a bad quality in a crisis. It was simply how she had always been, competent and directed in a way that left very little space for the people around her who were moving at a different pace. Naomi did not dislike her stepmother. She had spent years examining this honestly, because there was a simpler version of the story and she did not trust simple versions of complicated feelings. What she felt about Diane was more specific than dislike and harder to name. It was the feeling of watching someone handle everything her father loved as though it were simply something to be handled. Thomas Everett Whitfield had married Caroline Page on a June Saturday in 1991 in the Baptist Church on Elm Street in Carver. The photographs from that day, the one still in the leather album in the sideboard in the dining room, showed two people who were glad to be standing next to each other in the specific, uncontrived way that is, either there in a wedding photograph or it is not and cannot be manufactured. Naomi had studied those photographs as a child with the same attention most children give to things that feel both important and slightly mysterious. Her mother in the ivory dress she had made herself, because Caroline Page had been a woman who could make things with her hands. Her father in the blue suit he wore only twice after that, once to his father's funeral and once to Caroline's. Caroline Page had been a woman who kept a garden that was the envy of every neighbor on Birchwood Lane. She had strong opinions about pie crust and no patience with anyone who cut corners in the kitchen. She read widely and could carry a serious conversation about almost any subject if you were willing to take it seriously alongside her. She sang off-key with complete confidence and was fully aware of it and did not care at all. She had been the person Thomas called from every business trip, not once in the evening but twice, once after lunch and once before bed. At her funeral, in the parking lot of the church on Elm Street, before he could make himself go back inside, Thomas had told Naomi that he had picked up his phone 4 times that week to call her and had gotten 3 rings into each attempt before he remembered. Caroline Whitfield died of pancreatic cancer in May of 2008. Naomi was 14. The cancer had been diagnosed in November of 2007 and had moved faster than the oncologist, who had been very honest about the prognosis from the beginning, had quite prepared any of them for. Naomi had been with her mother at the end. Thomas had been in the room. Ruth had been down the hall. It had been early morning, the light not yet full, and the maple in the backyard was coming into its new leaves. In the weeks before she died, Caroline had asked Naomi to do one thing. She had said it plainly, without ceremony, the way she said most things. She had said, "I need you to watch and remember everything you can, because the things you know about a person are what keep them real after they are gone, and real is what I want to stay." Naomi had said she would. She had meant it. She had kept that promise in the way you keep promises that cost you something every day, without drama, without making a ceremony of it, just by doing it. She was thinking about that now in the kitchen of the house she had grown up in, with Gerald Adkins arriving in just over an hour, and her stepmother walking across the master bedroom floor in heels. Thomas did not date anyone for 4 years after Caroline died. Naomi had been aware of this the way a teenager is aware of a parent's interior life, at the edges without much analysis. She had been 15, then 16, then 18 and leaving for college in Athens, Georgia on a scholarship she had worked 2 summer jobs to help fund. She studied contracts law and called her father every Sunday from the dorm hallway and came home for Christmas and Thanksgiving and the long weekends when she could manage it. He had been fine. He had been rebuilding, in the steady, methodical way he did most things, putting one thing back in order before moving to the next, never making a performance of the grief and never pretending it was not there. He met Diane Holloway at a business conference in Savannah in September of 2016. He mentioned her casually the following Sunday phone call. A woman he had spoken to at dinner. Interesting, he had said. She works in real estate, ran her own firm for 15 years. Naomi had asked if he liked her and he had been quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was deciding whether to be honest about something personal. Then he said, "I think I might. We'll see." Diane Holloway was 45 when Thomas met her. She had been married once before, briefly, in her early 30s, to a man named Philip Crane who sold commercial insurance. She had 2 children from that marriage. Brandon was 24 when Naomi first met him, at a Sunday dinner at the house on Birchwood Lane in March 2017. A day caught between winter and spring. The air still cold but the light already shifted. Kelsey was 21. Thomas had made chili. He had introduced Diane with the careful warmth of a man who is genuinely happy and somewhat nervous about whether the people he loves are going to be happy about it too, and Naomi had recognized this immediately, because she had been reading her father's face for 23 years. She had tried to like Diane from the beginning. She made a genuine effort, the only kind she knew how to make. She asked Diane questions and listened to the answers and found Diane to be sharp and organized and dry in her humor in a way Naomi could appreciate. She had watched the way Diane looked at her father and had not found anything missing in it. Driving back to Athens that night, she had thought that the thing she had been most afraid of, that her father might choose someone who did not deserve him, did not appear to be what was happening. What she had not yet understood, at 22, having dinner with a woman she had known for 3 hours, was that the people who are hardest to read clearly are often the ones who are very good at presenting exactly what they want you to see. She would understand this the way you learn the things that matter most. Not from being told. From watching. Thomas and Diane married in June of 2017, a small ceremony in the backyard of the Carver house. Naomi stood as maid of honor in a blue dress her father had told her looked like the color of the sky right before a storm, which he had meant as a compliment and she had taken as one. Ruth was there. Brandon and Kelsey were there. A small circle of friends and colleagues. The maple was in full leaf and it had been a warm evening and Naomi had been genuinely glad for her father. She was certain of this in her own memory. She had examined it closely enough times to be sure. What began to shift in the months after the wedding was not dramatic. It never is with the things that matter. There is no single moment you can point to as the one that changed everything. There is instead a collection of small moments that you find yourself carrying before you understand that carrying them has become part of your daily life. The first one she could identify came at Thanksgiving, 6 months after the wedding. She drove up from Athens expecting the particular shape of the Whitfield Thanksgiving, which had its own rituals accumulated over decades. The turkey dinner instead of chili she had accepted years ago, but the rest of it, the football game, the cards, the long-running joke about the centerpiece that she and Thomas had kept alive for years, was supposed to be intact. She arrived on a Wednesday evening to find the dining room rearranged. Not dramatically. The table was 4 feet to the left. The sideboard, where the leather photograph album lived, had been moved to the corner under the window instead of against the main wall. The photographs in the hallway, her parents' wedding, Naomi at various ages, Thomas's parents on their 40th anniversary, had been joined by new ones. Diane and Thomas in Savannah. Diane's children at Christmas. A professional family photograph taken in the early months of the marriage that included Diane and Brandon and Kelsey and Thomas. Taken on a day Naomi had been in Athens finishing her thesis and had not been there. She had looked at that photograph for a long time. Then she put her bags in her old room and came downstairs and made herself useful in the kitchen. There was nothing wrong with any of it, not individually, not when you described any one piece of it to someone outside it. That was the thing she would come to understand. The photograph on the wall was not a cruelty. The conversation in the kitchen that evening was pleasant enough. It was simply that the house was slowly becoming a different house than the one she had grown up in, and she was slowly becoming a guest in it rather than a daughter of it, and this happened the way most significant shifts happen, so gradually that the person experiencing it cannot identify the precise moment it began. Brandon and Kelsey were another matter. Brandon Crane was 25 when his mother married Thomas. He was tall and blonde and sold cars at a dealership in Marietta, and he had his mother's organizational efficiency without her intelligence, which produced a particular kind of confidence, the kind that fills a room before it has done anything to earn the right. He called Thomas by his first name from the first dinner. He asked about Whitfield Building Supply with the attentiveness of someone conducting an assessment rather than a conversation, and Naomi had sat across the table watching him and feeling something she could not immediately name. She named it later. It was the feeling you get when you understand that someone is calculating something and would prefer you not notice. Kelsey was softer in manner, quieter, and Naomi had initially thought of her as someone who might become something like a friend, given time. What she came to understand was that Kelsey's softness was not the softness of warmth or openness. It was the softness of someone who moves in whatever current is strongest. When her mother was pleased, Kelsey was pleasant. When her mother was displeased, Kelsey was distant. She was not driving anything. She was along for the ride in whatever direction the vehicle was moving. And the vehicle, Naomi came to understand over time, was Diane. It happened slowly. That is the only honest way to explain it, and the slowness was the mechanism. Because slow means gradual and gradual means difficult to name, and difficult to name means nearly impossible to argue against. because any single instance, described to someone outside of it, sounds like nothing. Like you being oversensitive about rearranged furniture and a photograph on a wall. She was not being oversensitive about the rearranged furniture. What she was watching across 7 years was the steady and efficient reorganization of her father's life into something with very little room for Naomi in it. Not by confrontation. Diane was not a woman who worked through confrontation. By arrangement. By the slow reordering of priorities and calendars and conversations until the shape of Thomas Whitfield's daily existence had been rebuilt around his new family and its requirements, and the old shape, the one with Naomi at the center of it, had been allowed to become something smaller and further away. The Sunday phone calls became shorter. Not because her father loved her less. Because Sunday had become a busy day in the Carver house. Diane's mother visited on alternate Sundays. Brandon and Kelsey came for dinner. There were social obligations that Diane managed with the thoroughness of a professional, and Thomas was not a man who refused social obligations. He said yes to what was put in front of him by the people he trusted, and Diane was very good at putting things in front of him. Naomi had driven up from Savannah one Saturday in the spring of 2019 without calling ahead, which she had always been able to do. It had always been the kind of relationship she had with her father. She arrived to find the house full of people she did not know. A dinner party. 12 of Diane's friends from her real estate years, spread across the dining room and the back deck. Thomas had come to the front door when she knocked, and his face had done something complicated. Surprised and glad, and something else she could not immediately read. "Come in," he had said. He had said it warmly. He had hugged her and introduced her to people who smiled at her with the mild, pleasant interest of people meeting someone they had heard about in general terms and were now placing into a room. She had stayed for dinner and made conversation and been, she knew, gracious. She was always gracious. Her mother had insisted on it, not as a performance but as a practice. Grace is a practice, Caroline had said once, not a feeling. You do it even when it doesn't feel natural, and eventually it becomes second nature. Driving back to Savannah that night, Naomi called Ruth. "I didn't know about the dinner party," she had said. Ruth had been quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know. Did he know I was coming?" Naomi had asked. "I don't know," Ruth had said. She said it carefully, in the way of someone who knows more than they are saying and is deciding whether the moment is right to say it. Ruth, Naomi had said, and Ruth had told her. What Ruth told her was not dramatic. It was small and specific and had the particular weight of something said in a room by someone who did not know they were being witnessed. At a family dinner in February, 6 weeks earlier, Naomi's name had come up, and Diane had spoken about her in the way you speak about something that represents an inconvenience you have already arranged around. She had used the word independent. She had said, "Thomas's daughter is very independent. She manages her own life down in Savannah and she doesn't really need much from us." She had said it pleasantly, in the dry observational register she used in company, and the table had nodded and the subject had moved on. Independent, Naomi had said to Ruth. That's how she framed it, Ruth had said. "I was there. I heard it." Naomi had driven the last 40 miles home thinking about that word. It was technically true. She did manage her own life. She did not ask her father for money. She had built something in Savannah she was proud of. These were facts. And facts can be arranged around a person like furniture, placed to create a particular picture of a room, until someone walks in who knows where the furniture used to stand and can see exactly what has been moved and why. The business was the piece she came to understand last and most fully. Whitfield Building Supply had been founded by her grandfather in 1967 as a small hardware store with 2 employees and a modest inventory. Thomas had grown it over 30 years, adding a commercial division in the late 90s that now made up 40% of revenue. It was not a large business by any measure that required a spreadsheet to hold the ego. But it was solid and well-run, and it had survived 3 economic downturns and a warehouse fire in 2003 that had been rebuilt within 4 months because the 42 people who worked there showed up on weekends to help. Naomi had grown up understanding it the way you understand something that is simply part of your childhood's air. She had spent summers there as a teenager, learning the inventory system, helping at the register when it was busy. She had loved it the way you love the things that are your father's that he has made partly yours by letting you inside them. She had not planned to go into it professionally. Her work in construction contracts was adjacent but her own, and she had built something in Savannah she intended to keep building. But she had always assumed the business would stay in the family. Her father had said so more than once, including in a conversation 3 years ago over dinner in Savannah when he had been talking about the long-term plan and had said he wanted Whitfield Building Supply to stay what it had always been. He had looked at her when he said it. She had understood what he meant. Brandon Crane had joined the business in 2020. He had come in as a sales consultant, which was Diane's framing, brought in to modernize the commercial accounts division. Thomas had been 64 and beginning to think about the next phase of his life, which made him open to help in a way he might not have been 5 years earlier. Brandon was energetic and presentable, and he had numbers from his car dealership work that looked good if you did not ask too many questions about the structure behind them. Thomas had liked him. Brandon was likable when he chose to be. That was the other thing about him. He understood, the way his mother understood, the importance of managing what other people saw. Naomi had been to Carver for Easter that year, 2 months after Brandon started. She had sat across the dinner table from him and watched him talk about the commercial accounts, and she had seen the thing she had first noticed at that Sunday dinner in 2017. The quality of a man conducting an assessment. But the object of the assessment had sharpened. He had questions about the long-term contracts, about which clients had been with the business longest and why, about the land the warehouse sat on and what it was worth per square foot in the current market. She listened and said nothing. She called Ruth on the drive home. Ruth had said, "Your daddy thinks he's being helped." And Naomi had said, "I know." They sat with that on the phone in the way she and Ruth had learned to sit with things that were not yet ready to be changed. The first stroke, what the doctors called a transient ischemic attack, happened in October of 2021. A warning. Thomas had paid attention in the specific ways a man of his generation paid attention to a medical event. He had cut back on salt. He had seen the cardiologist. He had started walking every morning. What he had not done was step back from the business, because the business was not the kind of thing you step back from partially. You were either in it or you were not, and Thomas Whitfield had never known how to be not in it. Brandon stepped into the gap the reduced hours created. By the time Naomi understood the full shape of what was happening, it had been happening for 2 years. Brandon was no longer a sales consultant. He had a title, Vice President of Commercial Development, that Diane had suggested and Thomas had approved, and he had a salary Naomi did not know the number of, and an office in the main building, and he had been present at 2 of the 3 key supplier meetings that year. He had recommended the company that now serviced the fleet of delivery vehicles, a company run by a friend of his from the car dealership. She had found out about the fleet contract from Don Marsh, who had driven for Whitfield Building Supply since 1994, and who pulled her aside at her father's 4th of July cookout in 2022 to say, in the low voice of a man choosing his words carefully, that the new vehicles were having problems and that nobody seemed interested in hearing about it from the drivers. She had gone inside and found her father in the kitchen refilling the cooler and told him what Don had said. Thomas had looked at her with an expression she had been seeing more often in those years. The expression of a man managing something he has not named out loud and does not quite know how to be told about. He had said, "I'll look into it." She had said, "Dad." He had said, "I will look into it, Naomi. I hear you." She had looked at him in that kitchen and seen a man who was tired in a way that went further than the cardiologist's kind of tired. She understood that the full thing she needed to say was not something she could deliver to him on the 4th of July with 60 people in the backyard. She had not said it. She handed him the ice bags and went back outside. This was what she thought about most in the weeks after he died. The conversations she had not had when she had the chance to have them. The second stroke happened in October of 2023. It was not mild. Naomi drove those 3 hours again, arrived at Carver General again, found Ruth in the same waiting room with the same styrofoam coffee. But this time the cardiologist's language was different, and the prognosis delivered in the small conference room with the round table was specific and serious and not organized around any word that meant temporary or fine. He had recovered partial function over 6 weeks of rehabilitation. He came home in November walking with a cane, his speech somewhat slower, his right hand weaker, the hand he wrote with, the hand that had filled all those legal pads. Naomi took leave from her job in Savannah and moved back into her old room to help. A hospital bed was set up in the downstairs bedroom. A physical therapist came 3 mornings a week. Those 6 weeks were the most time she had spent in that house since she left for college. She was in her old room with the same desk and the same window looking out at the maple, and she was there to help, and she helped in every way she could. She drove her father to his appointments and sat with him during the physical therapy sessions and made dinner on the nights the visiting nurse was not there and read him the newspaper in the mornings because reading for long periods still gave him headaches. She also noticed things. She had the time to notice them now, which is the one thing close quarters in a house gives you that weekend visits do not. She noticed the way Diane spoke to her father when she thought Naomi was out of earshot. Not unkindly. That was never Diane's register. But with a particular efficiency that treated him less like a husband recovering from a serious medical event and more like a project being managed. She noticed that Brandon came by twice a week with papers requiring Thomas's signature, business documents, and how brief those review sessions were. Thomas would sit at the kitchen table and Brandon would stand beside him and point to the signature lines, and Thomas's weaker right hand would make its effortful mark. She noticed that she was never present for these signings. They happened in the mornings when she was at the pharmacy picking up medications, or in the early afternoons when she drove Thomas to his appointments. She began to pay closer attention. On a Thursday morning in the 4th week of her stay, she came back from a prescription run earlier than expected to find Brandon at the kitchen table with her father and a document she could not read from the doorway. She came in and said, "What's this?" Brandon looked up with the smooth, immediate pleasantness of someone who had prepared for exactly that question. He said it was a routine operational agreement, a supplier contract that needed a second signature for the bank. Thomas looked at her across the table. She looked back at him. There was something in his face she could not fully decode. Something she would carry afterward and turn over many times. It might have been embarrassment. It might have been something he was trying to tell her without the words for it. She sat down at the table. She said, "Can I see it?" Brandon paused for half a second. Then he said of course and pushed it toward her. She was a contracts coordinator. She read documents for a living and understood them and read quickly. She read the whole thing in 4 minutes, which she could see was making Brandon uncomfortable, because he was not accustomed to people reading all the way through. It was a supplier agreement. In Section 7 there was a compensation clause, related to the facilitation of a new long-term supplier arrangement, that allocated a fee of 6% of the annual contract value to a specific entity, identified by company name rather than personal name. For each year the arrangement continued. The company name was B. Crane Consulting, LLC. She set the document on the table. She looked at Brandon. She looked at her father. Thomas was looking at his hands. She said, "Dad, do you understand what this clause means?" He said, "Brandon explained it." She said, "I'd like to explain it in a different way, if that's all right." Brandon began to speak and she said, still looking at her father, "I'm talking to my father, Brandon." The silence that followed was specific. The silence of someone who has overstepped by exactly 1 count and knows it but has no graceful way to step back from it. She explained the clause to her father in plain language. The 6%. The company name. The connection between that company name and the person standing across the table. Thomas was very still while she spoke. When she finished, he looked at Brandon for a long time. Brandon offered an explanation. It was smooth and well-constructed, in the way of a man who has been building these explanations for a while. The consulting fee was standard for facilitated commercial arrangements. The company was a formal structure he had set up on legal advice for tax purposes. This kind of arrangement was common practice. Thomas said, "Is it in the other supplier agreements?" Brandon paused. Thomas said, "The other contracts you've brought me this year. Is this clause in those too?" He did not look at Brandon when he said it. He looked at the window, the October window with the maple going red. Brandon did not answer for 2 seconds. 2 seconds longer than an honest answer requires. Naomi sat at that kitchen table and watched her father's face. She watched him arrive at something she had been living near for years. She watched it settle on him in the way realizations settle on a person who has been trusting what they were given and has just understood the cost of that trust. Thomas said, I need to see all of them. He said, Brandon, I'd like you to go home. We'll talk tomorrow. Brandon left. The pleasantness went with him. She and her father sat in the kitchen for a long time after. The afternoon light moved across the table at the low November angle. She made tea. He had not asked her to. She made it because there was something useful to do with her hands while she was also sitting still. Eventually he said, How long have you known? She said, I wasn't sure. I've been watching. He said, Why didn't you tell me? She looked at him across the kitchen table, at his face she had been learning to read for 30 years, at the right hand resting beside his untouched tea. She said, I tried on the 4th of July. He looked at the window for a long time. Then he said, You were right to say it then. I should have listened. She said, You weren't ready. He was quiet. Then he said, I want to go over everything he's brought me this year. I want to understand what I've signed. She said, I know. We'll do it. And they did. Over the next 3 weeks, before she went back to Savannah, they went through every document. She explained each one in plain terms, without dramatics. Some were unremarkable. 2 of the supplier agreements contained the B. Crane consulting clause. The total value of those clauses over the projected contract terms was more than she had hoped and less than she had feared. But it was real money taken from a business that had belonged to this family for nearly 6 decades, and it had been taken with Thomas's signature on it. A signature made by a weaker hand in the mornings when his daughter was at the pharmacy. When she finished laying it out, Thomas said, I want Gerald to look at this. Gerald Atkins, who had handled Thomas's legal affairs for 20 years. Yes. She did not know whether he had called Gerald before the last stroke. She knew he had intended to. He had said so, standing at the back door on the last evening before she drove south to Savannah, looking out at the November garden. Get things sorted. That was the phrase he used. She had hugged him and told him she loved him and driven south. In March he had another stroke. It was the last one. He had been at home and Ruth had been there, and he had been moved to Carver General and had not come home from it. Naomi had been there. She had held his hand. Diane had been there. Brandon and Kelsey had been there. Ruth had been there. He had been gone within 48 hours of the ambulance arriving on a Thursday morning that had done nothing to signal what it was carrying. The will had been drawn up with Gerald Atkins 8 years ago, 2 years after the wedding. Diane had been present for the signing of it, and she had mentioned this to Naomi at the reception after the funeral, in a conversation that seemed at the time like a kindness, a preparation, a way of letting Naomi know what to expect so the reading would not come as a surprise. She had said, Your father was very thorough when he did the will. He wanted to make sure everything was clear. She had said it pleasantly, with her practical warmth, and Naomi had nodded and said thank you and nothing more. 3 days later, Naomi had been coming back from the garden, where she had gone to get some air, and she had come through the back door that was not entirely closed. She heard Diane's voice from the kitchen, lower than its usual register, the voice she used when she believed no one was listening. She said, It's all going to be fine. I had him sorted years ago. She said, No, she's not going to be a problem. Thomas was always clear about the business. She said, Brandon has been doing the groundwork for 2 years. We're in a good position. Then she heard the back door swing wider and her voice shifted immediately, and she came around the corner into the kitchen and said, Naomi, I didn't hear you come in. Can I get you anything? Naomi looked at her. She said, No, thank you. I'm going upstairs. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her old bed. She was very still for a long time. Then she took her phone from her pocket and she made a decision. The next morning she was awake at 4:45, which was the same time she was awake now, on the morning of the will reading. She had come downstairs and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the maple in the first gray of the morning and thought about her father's legal pad. About the test he had described, the one that told you which things were worth keeping. You pick up the pen. Or you don't. The things you write down are the ones that actually mattered. She had thought about what she was willing to do and what she was not, and where the line was between protecting something and making it worse by how you went about protecting it. She had thought about her father standing at the back door in November. Get things sorted. She had thought, Then I will help. On that morning, 3 days after the funeral, she had sat at the kitchen table and held her phone. Diane had come downstairs and the phone had been lying face down between the coffee mug and the fruit bowl, and the voice memo application had been running, and Naomi had sat in the kitchen and listened and asked careful, ordinary questions about the coming days, the logistics of the estate, the arrangements for the reading, and Diane had talked. What Diane said that morning, believing she was making conversation with a grieving stepdaughter over a quiet breakfast, believing the phone on the table between them was simply a phone, was now saved in a file that Naomi had listened to 3 times and had copied to 2 places for safekeeping. She had driven to Atlanta the following day and paid a small electronics shop to convert it to a format that would play cleanly on Gerald Adkins's laptop. She had brought the result with her on a USB drive that was in her apron pocket right now, in the kitchen of the house she had grown up in, with the maple letting go of its November leaves. She heard heels on the stairs. Naomi poured her cold coffee down the sink and rinsed the mug and set it on the drying rack. She dried her hands. She took a breath. She had found, in the weeks since her father died, that she did not need to rehearse anything. She knew what she knew. She had learned how to carry it from a woman who had asked her to watch and remember, who had said that the things you know about a person are what keep them real after they are gone. She also knew, in the way she had come to know things over 31 years of watching her father run a business and love her mother and grieve her and try again, that the truth belongs to the people it was taken from, even when it arrives too late to save them. It had belonged to Thomas Whitfield. It belonged to his daughter now. In 40 minutes, Gerald Adkins would arrive. In an hour he would open the folder containing the will Thomas Whitfield had signed 8 years ago, 2 years into his second marriage, before the strokes and the documents and the October conversation at the kitchen table and the November evening at the back door and everything else that had happened between that will and this morning. Diane walked into the kitchen in the black heels with the gold buckle. She looked composed and put together in the way she always looked, which was the way of a woman who had been preparing for this specific morning for a long time. Naomi looked at her. She thought about what was in her apron pocket. She thought about her father's voice, standing at the back door in November, looking at the garden he would not see in spring. Get things sorted. She turned and put the kettle on. She said, "Good morning, Diane." Diane said, "Good morning, Naomi. How did you sleep?" She said, "Well enough. Gerald will be here soon." Diane said, "Yes, he will." They stood together in the kitchen of the house on Birchwood Lane in the November morning. Outside the window the maple her father had planted was letting go of its leaves. One at a time, no ceremony, no hurry. Somewhere in the house a clock was moving toward 10 o'clock, and everything that was about to happen was already decided, not by either of the women standing in this kitchen, but by the choices that had been made by everyone in this house across the years that led to this morning. Which is, in the end, how everything is decided. Naomi wrapped her hands around the warm kettle and waited. Gerald Adkins arrived at 9 minutes past 10 in a gray wool coat that had seen many years of November weather in Carver and had the quality of something well-made and properly cared for across a long time. He was 71 years old, a compact man with close-cut white hair and reading glasses he kept in the breast pocket of his jacket, and he had the manner of someone who had sat at many family tables in difficult circumstances and had long since learned to bring the same steadiness to each one. He shook hands with Diane at the door. He nodded at Naomi in the kitchen doorway. He set his briefcase on the dining table that Naomi had moved to the center of the living room that morning for this purpose, and he said, "Should we give it another few minutes?" Naomi said, "Ruth is on her way." Diane said, "Of course." They waited. Naomi stood at the kitchen counter with a glass of water she was not drinking. Diane sat in the living room in the chair that had always been Thomas's, arranging the hem of her black skirt with the small automatic gestures of a woman managing her composure by managing her appearance. Gerald opened his briefcase and organized papers he had organized before he arrived. Ruth pulled into the driveway at 17 minutes past 10. Naomi watched her through the kitchen window, watched her sit in the car for a moment before coming in, which was something Ruth did at the hard things. A breath before the next step. Then she came through the front door Naomi had left on the latch. She was in the dark blue coat she wore to serious occasions. She looked at Naomi in the kitchen doorway. Neither of them spoke. They looked at each other in the way of two people who have been talking without words for many years and did not need to start now. Brandon and Kelsey arrived together at 20 past 10. Brandon in a dark jacket that was slightly too formal for a Tuesday morning in November, which told Naomi something. Kelsey still doing the last button on her coat when she came through the door. Brandon moved directly toward Gerald with the practiced friendliness of a man who understands the importance of establishing his presence in a room at the earliest possible moment. He said, "Gerald, good to see you. Appreciate you coming out." Gerald said, "Of course." Then he went back to his papers, which was the appropriate response to that particular kind of friendliness. They gathered in the living room. Gerald at the dining table, Diane on the sofa, Brandon close beside her, Kelsey at the far end of it. Naomi took the armchair that faced the sofa. Ruth took the upholstered chair next to her. The room arranged itself into the geography of what it actually was, the two sides of something that had called itself a family, sitting across from each other in a house that had been Thomas Whitfield's, on a November morning that was bright and cold and had nothing particular to say about any of it. Gerald put his reading glasses on. He looked at them over the frames. He said, "Before we begin, I want to say that Thomas was a client and a friend of mine for a great many years, and I'm sorry for the loss of him. I mean that genuinely. He was a good man, and this town is less without him." No one spoke. The room held it. Gerald said, "We'll proceed." He explained, as he was required to, that he would read the relevant provisions of the will as signed, that all parties present would receive copies of the document, and that he would be available to answer questions of a factual nature after the reading was complete. He said, "Any questions of a legal nature regarding interpretation or contest should be directed to your own counsel." He said it without emphasis. It was information, not a warning, though it was also a warning. Diane nodded. Brandon nodded. Kelsey looked at her mother. Naomi looked at the window behind Gerald's left shoulder, at the maple outside it, at the pale November sky above the last of its leaves. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Gerald began to read. The will of Thomas Everett Whitfield had been signed on the 14th of September, 8 years ago, in Gerald's office on Carver's Main Street, in the presence of two witnesses whose names appeared at the bottom of the last page. It had been drawn up 2 years into Thomas's marriage to Diane, at a time when the business was healthy and the household was still finding its shape, and Thomas had been a man with what appeared to be a settled and comfortable future ahead of him. The preamble was standard language, and Gerald read it with the neutral steadiness of someone who has read preambles many times and understands that their purpose is to establish the legal validity of what follows rather than to say anything of weight. Then the first substantive provision. The property at 14 Birchwood Lane, Carver, Georgia, its contents and the land on which it stood, were bequeathed to Diane Louise Whitfield, to be held in her name outright. Diane did not move when Gerald read this. Naomi had known it was coming. The house had never been Thomas's primary concern. He had been practical about it, the way he was practical about most things. Diane had lived in it for 8 years. It was her home in the real, daily way, and Thomas had never been a man who would make a widow find a new place to live. Naomi had accepted this, and she accepted it now, sitting in her armchair, looking at the window. The second provision covered the savings accounts and the investment portfolio. Gerald read the figures. The estate, after costs and debts, was divided 60% to Diane Louise Whitfield and 40% to Naomi Grace Whitfield. The numbers were real. Thomas had been responsible with money his whole life, and the estate was larger than Naomi had expected, and the 40% was not a small thing. She felt the weight of it the way you feel the weight of something that was never the point. The third provision was the one she had been waiting for. Gerald read it carefully, which was the only way he read anything. He said, "The ownership shares of Whitfield Building Supply, LLC, as currently held by Thomas Everett Whitfield, being 100% of the outstanding shares, are to be divided as follows. 60% to Diane Louise Whitfield, to be held as a passive ownership stake, with all operational management and authority to be exercised by a board of directors to be constituted within 90 days of the testator's passing. 40% to Naomi Grace Whitfield with full voting rights." He stopped. He looked at the room over his glasses. There was a silence. Beside his mother on the sofa, Brandon exhaled. It was a small sound, barely audible. But Naomi heard it. The passive ownership stake. Those were the words Thomas had used 8 years ago. When the business was doing well and he had been making plans for a future he expected to be peaceful and uncomplicated. 60% to Diane, held passively. The board to be constituted within 90 days. He had not specified what that board would look like. He had left the question open, which 8 years ago had probably seemed like a reasonable thing to leave open, and which now, with Brandon Crane sitting on his mother's left in a jacket slightly too formal for a Tuesday, was not reasonable to leave open at all. Gerald set the will on the table. He removed his glasses. He looked at all of them. Diane was the one who broke the silence. She said, "I think Thomas would want us to approach this as a family." She said it warmly, with the steady ease of a woman who had been preparing for this specific conversation for a long time and knew exactly how she intended to begin it. She said, "We've been talking about the board structure and I think we have a good framework. Brandon has been running the day-to-day operations effectively for more than a year, and it makes sense for him to continue in that capacity." Naomi looked at her, hands in her lap. Ruth looked at Diane. Brandon said, "We've already been in conversations with the key accounts. The relationships are solid. The transition can be very smooth." He said it with the ease of someone who has already moved past the discussion stage into the implementation stage and would prefer that gap not be noticed. Gerald said, "Any formal decisions about board structure and operational management will need to follow the process laid out in the operating agreement of the LLC, which is a separate document from the will and will require its own legal process." Brandon said, Of course. The of course of a man who means neither." Diane turned toward Naomi. Her voice shifted into the register of comfort, which she could produce with the ease of long practice. She said, "I know this isn't the simplest situation, Naomi, but your father trusted us to handle it sensibly, and I'd like to think we can honor that." She paused. "He was always realistic about where you were in your life. He knew Savannah was your priority. He never expected you to come back and run things day to day. Naomi let those words sit in the room. She looked at the window, the maple, the pale sky above it. Ruth said, from the chair beside her, "Gerald, can I ask a question?" Gerald said, "Of course." Ruth said, "The board that's to be constituted. Who has the authority to appoint the members?" Gerald said, "Under the operating agreement of the LLC, that would fall to the majority shareholder." Ruth said, "Which would be Diane." Gerald said, "Under the current document, yes." Ruth said nothing more. She looked at her hands. There was a silence, and in it Naomi could hear the shape of what had been built across 7 years and what it had been built to produce, and she could hear her father's voice from the back door in November, and she could feel the USB drive in her apron pocket, and she made the decision she had already made at 5 in the morning by the kitchen window. It was not a new decision. It was the completion of one she had been moving toward since the evening she came through a back door that was not entirely closed. She said, "Gerald." He looked at her. She said, "Before we discuss next steps, I'd like to play something." She reached into her apron pocket. She set the USB drive on the table in front of him. She said, "I'd like you to hear it before anyone makes any decisions about what happens next." The room changed. Nothing moved except the attention in it, which shifted all at once from the papers on the table to Naomi's face. Brandon looked at the drive. His expression did not change, which was its own kind of change. Diane looked at it and then at Naomi with a face that was entirely composed, which was another kind of change. Kelsey looked at her mother. Diane said, "What is that?" Naomi said, "An audio file. A recording." Diane said, "Of what?" Naomi said, "A conversation in this kitchen. 3 weeks ago. The morning of the 14th, 3 days after the funeral." There was a pause. Naomi could see Diane reassembling the morning in her memory, placing herself in the kitchen, placing Naomi across the table, placing the phone between them face down on the wood. She could see the moment Diane understood what it meant that the phone had been lying face down between them on that morning. Diane said, "Naomi, I don't think this is appropriate." Naomi said, "Gerald, I'd like you to hear it." Gerald looked at the drive on the table. He looked at Naomi. He said, Is this relevant to the estate and its administration? Naomi said, yes. Gerald said, then I'd like to hear it. Brandon said, we shouldn't be doing this without legal representation present. Gerald looked at him. He said, you're welcome to call your counsel. We can wait. Brandon was quiet for a moment. He looked at his mother. Diane said nothing. Her composure was intact. She was a woman who had maintained composure in difficult rooms before, and she knew how to do it, and she was doing it now. But Naomi had been watching her face for 7 years, and she could see, beneath the composure, the particular quality of a person doing a rapid calculation about whether the thing they are about to hear is as damaging as they suspect it is. She suspected it was. Gerald accepted the drive. He opened his laptop and inserted it and found the file and asked Naomi if she wanted him to start from the beginning. She said yes. The recording began. The first sounds were the kitchen. The specific acoustics of a kitchen in the early morning. The kettle. The sounds of 2 people moving in a shared space. The small clinks and shuffles of an ordinary breakfast. Then Diane's voice, clear and close to the phone, asking if Naomi had slept. Then Naomi's voice saying well enough. Then the sounds of making tea. The 2 of them finding things to do with their hands in the way of people who are together in a space that is not quite comfortable. Then Diane began to talk. She talked the way people talk when they are at ease in their own house on a morning that feels, from the inside, like a morning they have already survived. She talked with the ease of a woman who has spent years being careful and has decided, on this particular morning, that the careful time is behind her. She said, I want you to know, Naomi, that Thomas talked to me a great deal about what he wanted. In the last months. About what he wanted for the business and for the family. He was very clear about it. Naomi's voice on the recording said, what did he say? Diane said, he said the business needed continuity. That was the word he kept coming back to. Continuity. He said he worried that if it became complicated, if there was disagreement about direction, it would hurt the people who worked there. He always cared about the employees. You know how he was. In the living room, no one moved. Diane on the recording continued, Brandon has been working so hard. Your father saw that. He appreciated it. I think, toward the end, he understood that the transition was already happening and that the most loving thing he could do was let it happen cleanly. Ruth made a sound beside Naomi. Not a word. Just a sound. From somewhere that was not going to let itself become anything larger in a room full of other people. The recording continued. There was a pause in the conversation. Then the sound of Diane's chair moving. Her footsteps crossing the kitchen floor. Then a shift in the acoustics, the particular quality of a voice moving slightly away from the recording device and becoming more careful in its register. She was calling someone. Her voice in this section was the lower register. The same one Naomi had heard through the back door 3 nights before she sat across from Diane at the kitchen table with the phone lying face down between them. She said, she's taking it well. She paused, listening. The filing on the operating agreement needs to go in before the end of the month. Tell Brandon to have everything ready. She paused again. No, she's not a problem. She chose Savannah. We didn't choose that for her. There was a sound on the other end of the line that could not be made out. Then Diane said, I know. But I always told Thomas. A business is like a garden. You can't hold on to things that aren't growing in the right direction. He came to understand that. It just took him a while. The sound of the call ending. Her footsteps back across the kitchen floor. Then her voice returning to its full, comfortable register as she settled back into her chair. She said to Naomi, who had been sitting there the entire time, with the recording running. Now, where were we? Naomi's voice said, the business. And Diane said, right, the business. Well, I think the important thing is that we all want the same thing. We all want what's best for it. She paused. Your father was a practical man, Naomi. In the end, he was very practical. Gerald reached forward and stopped the recording. The living room was completely quiet. Naomi looked at the window, the maple, the sky. Diane was looking at the table. Her composure was still in place, which was its own remarkable thing. The composure of a woman who has built something carefully across many years and is not going to let it come apart in the 30 seconds after a recording ends. She said, after a moment, in a voice that was controlled and deliberate, I was speaking generally. What I said about gardening, about direction, that was about the business in general terms. About making hard decisions for the right reasons. I don't think it's fair to take that out of context, and Ruth said, Diane. It was one word, and Ruth said it in the specific way she said things when she was done being careful. Not loud, not harsh, just final. The way a door closes when someone who has made a decision closes it. Diane looked at her. Ruth said, you said you had him sorted years ago. That was your phrase. Those were your words. Diane was quiet. Brandon said, this recording was made without consent. In Georgia, that's potentially, Gerald said. Georgia is a one-party consent state for the purpose of recording a conversation in which you are a participant. He said it without any particular emphasis as a fact because it was a fact. Brandon stopped. Kelsey had been looking at her mother since the recording began. She was still looking at her now, and there was something in her face that Naomi had not seen there before. Something that was less the blankness of someone who floats in whatever current is strongest and more the look of a person who has just understood which direction the current has been running and what it was carrying all along. Gerald removed his glasses. He held them in both hands and looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at all of them in turn, at each person in the room, and then he said, there is something else. The room waited. He said, I want to explain the context before I produce the document because I think the context matters here. He paused. In December of last year, Thomas Whitfield came to see me. He came to my office on Carver's Main Street, where he had come to see me for 20 years. He came with a legal pad. Naomi looked at him. She had not known this. She had known her father intended to call Gerald. She had not known he had. Ruth went very still beside her. Gerald said, he told me what his daughter had shown him. He told me about the supplier agreements, about the compensation clauses. He told me he had not known what was in those documents when he signed them. He said he had been preparing to do something about it and he wanted to do it properly, which was how Thomas did everything. He said he wanted whatever he put in place to be, and this was the word he used, airtight. The room was very still. Gerald said, we met 3 times over December. I prepared a codicil to his will. A codicil is a legally binding amendment to an existing will, executed with the same formality as the original document. Thomas signed it on the 19th of December. It was witnessed by 2 members of my staff. It is fully executed, fully valid, and it supersedes the relevant provisions of the original will. He reached into his briefcase. He produced a second folder, thinner than the first, and set it on the table beside the original will. Diane said, I wasn't told about any meetings in December. Gerald said, Thomas came alone. He was entirely within his legal right to amend his will without informing any beneficiary in advance. Diane said, I am his wife. Gerald said, you are named in the document. He said it without inflection. As is Naomi. He opened the second folder. He put his reading glasses back on. He said, I'll read the relevant provisions. He read. The codicil began with the formal preamble. Gerald moved through at the same measured pace he moved through everything. Then it reached its substance. Thomas Everett Whitfield, being of sound mind and full legal capacity, hereby amends the provisions of his will dated September 14th as follows. The ownership shares of Whitfield Building Supply, LLC, being 100% of the outstanding shares held by the testator, are hereby bequeathed in their entirety to Naomi Grace Whitfield. Gerald paused for a fraction of a moment, then continued. The provision of the original will dividing said shares between Diane Louise Whitfield and Naomi Grace Whitfield is hereby revoked in its entirety. The Board of Directors' provision is similarly revoked. No board is to be constituted. Naomi Grace Whitfield shall assume full ownership and operational authority of Whitfield Building Supply, LLC upon the testator's death, with no conditions or restrictions on that authority. He turned the page. Any employment arrangements entered into between Whitfield Building Supply, LLC and individuals not previously employed by said company prior to January 1st of 2020 are to be reviewed by independent legal counsel within 60 days of the testator's passing. Particular attention is to be given to any compensation arrangements embedded within supplier contracts entered into after that date. Any such arrangements found to be in conflict with the interests of the company are to be addressed through appropriate legal remedy. He did not look up from the page while he read this provision. He turned to the final section. The bequest of the property at 14 Birchwood Lane remains as written in the original will. The savings and investment portfolio is hereby amended. 70% to Naomi Grace Whitfield. 30% to Diane Louise Whitfield. He closed the folder. He set his glasses on the table. He looked at all of them. In the living room of the house on Birchwood Lane, in the November morning, the quiet was complete. It was the quiet of a room in which something of considerable weight has just been set down in the center of it, and everyone present is still deciding whether to look at it directly. Brandon spoke first. He said, "This has to be contested." He said it immediately, which told Naomi he had been carrying the word contested as a contingency for some time, because a man does not produce it that quickly unless it has been available to him before the moment required it. Gerald said, "You're welcome to consult your own legal counsel. That is always your right." Brandon said, "On what basis did he amend it? What was he told? Who had access to him in December?" Gerald looked at him with the patient attention of a man who has spent 50 years practicing patience with difficult people. He said, "Thomas came to me of his own accord. The codicil was executed with full legal formality across 3 separate meetings. I can speak to his state of mind during each of those meetings, and I am prepared to do so in any legal proceeding." He paused. He was sharp. He knew exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. Brandon said, "He was recovering from a stroke." Gerald said he had recovered. His neurologist signed a formal capacity assessment in November of last year. "I have a copy of it in this file." He set a page on the table beside the codicil folder. He did not make a ceremony of it. He simply set it there. The silence that followed was different in quality from the silences that had come before it. This was the silence of a calculation arriving at a conclusion the calculator had not expected and could not immediately route around. Diane had not spoken since Gerald said, "There is something else." She was sitting on the sofa with her hands in her lap, and she was looking at the 2 folders on the table, the original will and the codicil, at the 20-some pages of a man's intentions for what would happen after he was gone, at the intentions he had held close enough that the woman who had shared his house for 8 years had known nothing about the second set of them. She said, finally, very controlled, "He didn't tell me." Naomi said nothing. Diane said, "We were married. He sat across from me at dinner every evening for 4 months, and he said nothing about any of this." She looked at Naomi. "Did you know he was going to do this?" Naomi said, "He told me he was going to get things sorted." Diane said, "That is not an answer to what I asked you." Naomi said, "It's the only answer I have." Diane looked at her for a long moment, and in that look was the full 7 years of them. The dinner party and the rearranged furniture and the word independent and the photograph on the wall taken on a day Naomi had not been there. All the steady, efficient reordering of a life that had taken someone else's house and someone else's history and someone else's husband and arranged them to serve its own requirements. And in Naomi's face looking back at her was the full 7 years of watching it happen, and holding the knowledge of it, and carrying it the way her mother had told her to carry things, without rushing to the moment before the moment was ready. The moment had been ready since 5 o'clock this morning. Ruth spoke. She had been sitting beside Naomi with her hands in her lap and the dark blue coat still buttoned. And now she looked at Gerald and said, "Can you explain, practically, what this means for the business?" Gerald said, "It means that Naomi is the sole owner of Whitfield Building Supply effective as of today. Any employment arrangements currently in place at the company are subject to the 60-day legal review described in the codicil. The supplier contracts flagged in that document will be reviewed by independent counsel, and any compensation provisions found to be irregular will be addressed through appropriate legal channels." Ruth said, "And the employees? The people who work there?" Gerald said, "Their positions are not affected by this document. The review is limited to arrangements entered into after January 2020 and specifically to compensation structures within supplier agreements. The business itself continues to operate." Ruth said, "Good," she said. It's simply the way she said things that were simply true. Kelsey said, "Mom." It was the first word she had spoken since the recording played. She said it in the tone of a child calling to a parent from across a distance that has opened between them that the child does not know how to cross. Diane did not answer her. She was looking at the table, at the two folders side by side, at the organized pages of what Thomas had wanted and what he had quietly corrected in December, 2 months before the morning in March that took him. Brandon said, "The operating agreement of the LLC still governs day-to-day management. That's a separate document and it has provisions for," Gerald said. "The operating agreement does govern operational procedures, yes. The ownership structure it references is now as described in the Codicil. 100% Naomi Whitfield. The voting rights, the authority over management decisions, the right to appoint or remove any operational position within the company, all of that flows from the ownership." He said it with the same even neutrality he had brought to everything. No satisfaction in it. Just clarity. Brandon looked at his mother. Diane was not looking at him. She was looking at Naomi. And Naomi was looking at the window, at the maple in the November morning, at the clear, bare branches, the structure of the thing fully visible now that most of its leaves had let go. She had always liked it this way in November, the bare version, the honest one, the one that showed you what the tree actually was, what it was built of, where the weight of it was held. Her father had stood at the back door one early winter and said, "People think winter strips the beauty out of things. But I always thought it just took away everything that wasn't the thing itself. Left you with the real part." She sat in the armchair in the living room of the house on Birchwood Lane and she held that and she thought about what the real part was. About the 42 people who had come in every morning for 31 years and built something alongside her father. About Don Marsh, who had been driving those routes since 1994 and had pulled her aside at a cookout to tell her the truth, because he thought someone who cared should know. About the real part of what her father had built, which had nothing to do with compensation clauses or operating agreements and everything to do with showing up every day for the right reasons. Gerald was gathering his papers. He said the 60-day clock on the legal review would begin today. He said his office would be in contact with Naomi to begin the formal transition of the LLC documents. He said all parties would receive copies of both documents by the end of the week. He looked at Naomi. He said, "Your father was very specific about what he wanted, across all 3 of our meetings in December. He did not come to me in anger. He came to me clearly. He said, 'Gerald, I know I should have paid closer attention sooner.' He said, 'But I'm paying it now. I want the right things to end up in the right hands.'" Naomi looked at him. She said, "That sounds like him." Gerald said, "It was very much like him." He paused. He also said something I've been thinking about since. He said that the hardest thing about getting older, about slowing down, was that you started to see the things you had been too busy to see before. He said he was grateful for that, even though it was hard. He said his daughter had helped him see. Naomi looked at the table. Gerald closed his briefcase. He stood. He shook Naomi's hand, then Ruth's. He nodded at Diane and at Brandon and at Kelsey. He said he would show himself out. He went to the front door and the sound of his footsteps in the hallway and the small click of the door closing were the last sounds of the formal proceeding. After that, there was only the living room and the people left in it. Diane stood. She smoothed the hem of her skirt with those same small, automatic gestures. She looked at Naomi across the room. She said, "I want you to know that I loved your father." Naomi looked at her. She considered what she knew about that, all of it, the full 7 years of evidence she had been accumulating and carrying. She said, "I know you believe that." It was the most honest thing she could say, and she said it without cruelty and without warmth, as a statement of what she actually knew, which was that Diane had loved Thomas Whitfield in the way she was capable of loving him, which was real but also managed, and that the two things were not mutually exclusive and did not change what had been done. Diane looked at her for a long moment. Then she walked out of the living room and they heard her steps on the stairs and the sound of the master bedroom door closing. Brandon said, "This isn't over." He said it in the voice of a man who has decided that defiance is the only posture still available to him. He picked up his jacket from the sofa arm. He did not look at Naomi when he said it, which was how she knew he was not entirely certain it was true. The people who are certain say the things that matter while looking at you. The ones who are performing certainty look at walls. He went out. The front door closed. Kelsey paused at the threshold of the living room. She looked at Naomi. Her face was doing something that might have been apology or might have been something smaller than apology that wanted to look like it. She said, "I'm sorry about your father." She said it directly to Naomi's face, which was more than Brandon had managed. Naomi said, "Thank you, Kelsey." Kelsey went. Ruth and Naomi sat in the living room of the house on Birchwood Lane in the silence after everyone had left it. The two folders on the dining table. The faint impression in the tablecloth where the briefcase had sat. Outside, the maple in the November morning. The sky pale and clear and offering nothing in particular about the enormity of what had just happened in this room. After a while, Ruth said, "He did it." Naomi said, "He did." Ruth said, "In December. All that time he was carrying it and none of us knew." Naomi said, "He told me he would get things sorted." Ruth made a sound. Not a word. The sound of grief and something like pride arriving in the same moment, the body unable to separate them cleanly. She reached over and put her hand over Naomi's on the arm of the chair. Naomi looked at their two hands. Ruth's hand, which had been in this house at every hard thing she could remember. Her own hand, which had carried a USB drive into this room this morning and had waited for 10 o'clock and had held steady through everything that came after it. She thought about her father sitting in Gerald Adkins's office in December, with his legal pad and his weaker right hand, explaining to a man he had trusted for 20 years what his daughter had shown him and what he needed done and that he needed it to be airtight. He had used that word 3 times across 3 meetings, according to Gerald, which meant he had written it on the legal pad, which meant it had passed the test. It had mattered enough to pick up the pen. She thought about him at the back door in November. Get things sorted. He had meant both halves of it. He had trusted her with one half and had taken the other half to Gerald himself, and between the two of them, without knowing what the other was doing, they had built something that held. Ruth said, "What are you going to do?" Naomi looked at the maple outside the window. The clear November branches. The real structure of the thing with everything stripped away. She said, "I'm going to go to the business. I'm going to talk to the people there. I'm going to find out exactly what's in those contracts and fix what needs to be fixed." Ruth said, "When?" Naomi said, "This afternoon." Ruth looked at her. Naomi said, "He built that business for 31 years. He built it before I was born. I'm not going to leave it sitting." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you want me to come?" Naomi looked at her aunt, in her dark blue coat, in the chair beside her, in the house they had both loved for different lengths of time and for the same reasons. She said, "Yes." Ruth said, "Then let's go." They sat for a moment more in the quiet of the house, in the November morning, and then they stood, and Naomi went to get her coat. They drove to Whitfield Building Supply in Ruth's car because Naomi had not yet thought about whether the Cavalier she had driven up from Savannah 3 weeks ago was going to need an oil change soon, which was a specific and ordinary thought to be having on the afternoon that she was driving to her father's business as its new sole owner, and she held it for a moment the way you hold ordinary thoughts when they arrive inside extraordinary days, with a kind of gratitude for their ordinariness. Ruth drove. Naomi sat in the passenger seat and watched Carver go past. The streets she had grown up knowing the names of, the courthouse and the hardware store and the diner on the corner of Ash and Second that had been there since before she was born and had the same sign it had always had. Her father had brought her to that diner for Saturday breakfast every 2 weeks from the time she was 5 until she left for college, and she had always ordered the same thing and he had always pretended not to know what she was going to order, and she had never once called him on it. The business was on Industrial Drive, a wide street on the east side of Carver that her grandfather had chosen in 1967 because the land was cheap and the access was good. It had grown in stages, the original building still there at the center with 2 additions coming off it at different angles, a sprawl that had never been pretty and had never tried to be, because Thomas Whitfield had spent money on inventory and people and not on the appearance of the building that housed them, which was the right priority and everyone who worked there knew it. Naomi had not called ahead. She had not known, when she left the house on Birchwood Lane, what she was going to say to the people inside this building, only that she needed to say something today, and that whatever she said needed to be true. Ruth parked. They sat in the car for a moment. Ruth said, "Do you want me to wait here?" Naomi said, "No. Come in." The front door of Whitfield Building Supply opened into a small reception area with a counter and a grid of product samples on the wall that her father had put up in 2009 and updated twice since then. Behind the counter, a woman named Patrice had worked the front desk for 11 years. She looked up when Naomi and Ruth came in, and her face did what faces do when they see someone they were not expecting and then immediately do the calculation of what that person being here might mean. She said, "Naomi." She said it with the warmth of someone who had known Naomi since she was a teenager coming in on summer mornings to learn the inventory system. And then, because Patrice was a person who paid attention, "Is everything all right?" Naomi said, "There's been some news from the estate this morning. I'd like to talk to everyone. Is Don here?" Patrice said, "He's out on the afternoon run. He'll be back by 3. Naomi said, "Good. Can you let people know I'd like to gather in the break room at 3? Anyone who can make it." Patrice looked at her. She said, "Of course." The break room at Whitfield Building Supply was a long room at the back of the main building with 2 folding tables pushed together in the center and a coffee maker that had been there so long it had become a fixed feature of the space rather than an appliance. At 3 o'clock, 26 of the 42 people who worked there were present. The rest were on deliveries or had finished their shifts. Naomi stood at the head of the tables and looked at the faces of people who had worked alongside her father for years, some of them for decades, and she thought about what she needed to say and how to say it, without making it more complicated than it was. She said, "This morning the reading of my father's estate took place. I want you to hear this from me directly rather than through anyone else. Thomas Whitfield left the business to me. I am the sole owner of Whitfield Building Supply as of today." She paused. She said, "I know there have been some changes over the past few years. Some arrangements that are going to be reviewed. That review will happen in the next 60 days and it's a legal process, but it concerns specific supplier contracts, not any of you. Your jobs are not part of this review. I want you to be clear about that." The room was quiet. Don Marsh had come in 2 minutes before 3, still in his jacket from the afternoon run. He was standing at the back of the room and he was looking at Naomi with the face of a man who had been waiting to hear something for a long time without quite knowing what form it was going to arrive in. She looked at him. She said, "Don, I owe you an apology. You told me something at the 4th of July cookout 2 years ago, something I should have done more with sooner than I did." Don said, "You were working with what you had." She said, "Still, I heard you. I should have done more." Don was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your daddy built something good here. We all know that. Whatever comes next, we'll work with you the same way we worked with him." She looked at him and at the room and at the 26 faces of people who had shown up every day to be part of the thing her father had built, and she said, "That's all I needed to hear. Thank you." She meant it. It was the complete truth of how she felt standing in that break room at 3 o'clock on a November afternoon, which was that she had no interest in making speeches about her plans for the future of the business. She had every interest in learning what those plans should be from the people who had been inside the building every day that she had been in Savannah. The 60-day legal review confirmed what the documents had suggested. The B. Crane consulting compensation clauses in the 2 supplier agreements represented a significant sum drawn from the business across 2 years. The independent counsel Gerald brought in to conduct the review recommended that those clauses be voided on the basis of undisclosed conflicts of interest, and that the amounts already paid under them be subject to recovery proceedings. They did not represent criminal activity, the counsel explained, but they were ethically and procedurally irregular in ways that were clear and documentable, which meant the business had a strong civil claim. Naomi made a decision about that claim. She consulted with Gerald and with the independent counsel and she thought about it carefully and then she said, "Pursue the recovery of the funds. Do not pursue punitive action beyond that." She said it because she was not interested in prolonged litigation and because the business needed the energy that a legal war would consume and because, in the end, the most useful thing she could do with what had happened was close it cleanly and move forward. This was not a generous decision toward Brandon. It was simply a practical one, and she was enough her father's daughter to know the difference. Brandon had engaged his own attorney within 48 hours of the will reading. His attorney had reviewed Gerald's documentation and had come back, according to Gerald, with the assessment that the codicil was airtight, which was a word Naomi had now heard applied to her father's intentions twice and both times felt the specific weight of it. The legal challenge was withdrawn before the month was out. Brandon left Carver and went back to Marietta, and whether he told people there what had happened or whether he found a version of the story that cast him in a more favorable light, Naomi did not know and found she did not particularly need to know. Diane had movers come to the house on Birchwood Lane in the first week of December. She had done the packing herself, the things that were hers, the silk throw pillows and the kitchen renovation she had chosen and the photographs that were not of the Whitfield family and the good dishes she had brought into the marriage. She took what was hers and she left what was not, and Naomi was not in the house when the movers came because she thought it was kinder to be somewhere else, and because she did not particularly want to watch. What Diane left behind, among the ordinary things of a household, was the leather photograph album in the sideboard. Naomi found it when she went back to the house that evening, on the shelf where it had always been, before the sideboard was moved to the corner under the window and then moved back after the sideboard was moved back, which Naomi had done on the second day she spent in the house after the will reading, because the sideboard belonged against the main wall and had always known it. She sat at the kitchen table with the album that evening and opened it to the first page. Her parents at their wedding on a June Saturday in 1991. Her mother in the ivory dress she had made herself. Her father in the blue suit. The specific, uncontrived gladness of two people who were glad to be standing next to each other. She looked at it for a long time. Kelsey had called her once, in the second week of December. It was a brief call and she had the tone of someone who had decided to make it and was going to complete it before the decision could reconsidering itself. She said, "I want you to know that I knew less than you probably think I did." She paused. "I'm not asking you to believe that. I just wanted you to know." Naomi said, "I hear you." Kelsey said, "I'm sorry about your father." She said it the same way she had said it at the threshold of the living room. Directly, to the point, with the feeling of someone saying a true thing rather than a performed one. Naomi said, "Thank you. I'm sorry for your part in this too." She meant that also, not as an absolution, as a statement of fact about how the damage of a thing spreads past the people who intended it to the people who were simply near it. Kelsey said, "That's more than I expected." Naomi said, "It's all I have." They did not speak again after that. Naomi thought about Kelsey sometimes in the months that followed, the way you think about someone who showed up at a situation not of their making and chose, in the end, to be honest rather than strategic. She hoped she was all right. She left it at that. In January she moved back to Carver. Not into the house on Birchwood Lane, not yet. There was still work to do on the transition and she needed to be in the business more than she needed to be in the house. She found a short-term rental 2 miles from the business and she drove to work every morning and she learned, in the way you can only learn by being inside a thing every day, exactly what Whitfield Building Supply was and what it needed. What it needed, it turned out, was not particularly dramatic. It needed someone who understood contracts to go through every supplier agreement systematically and renegotiate the ones that had been structured disadvantageously, which was the work she had been doing in Savannah for 9 years and which she was, in the specific and useful way her father had always valued, good at. It needed the commercial accounts division to be rebuilt around relationships rather than around commission structures, which meant some conversations with clients that were honest and some that were difficult, and all of which, once had, produced exactly the response she had hoped for, which was that the clients stayed, because they had been with Whitfield Building Supply for years and they stayed because of the quality of the work and not because of who was doing the sales. It needed Don Marsh to know that his judgment was valued and that his routes were his, which she had told him in January and which she saw in the way he carried himself in the building after that, with slightly less of the compressed watchfulness she recognized from the break room and slightly more of the ease of a person who has decided they are not waiting to be told to leave. It needed, in the most ordinary and important way, to be run by someone who understood that the 42 people inside it had come to work every day under the belief that the place they were coming to was worth coming to, and that the best thing she could do as its new owner was make sure that belief stayed well-founded. She found her father's last legal pad in the desk drawer in his office in February. She had not known it was there. She had been reorganizing the desk, which had accumulated the particular disorder of a person who left it intending to come back, and she had opened the bottom drawer and found the pad under a folder of vendor contact sheets. She sat down in her father's chair and held it. The last entries were from the autumn before he died. She could see where his handwriting had changed, the letters slightly wider, the pen pressure uneven in the way of someone working with a hand that was not as steady as it had been. He had written a list of names, which she recognized as the names of the key commercial clients. He had written questions next to some of them, things he wanted to look up or verify. He had written at the bottom of that page, in letters slightly larger than everything above them, as though he had pressed down with the intention of being clear, "Call Gerald." December. She turned the page. The next page had 4 words written on it, and nothing else. She read them. She sat in the chair in the office her father had occupied for 31 years, and she read those 4 words, and she did not try to manage what arrived in her when she read them. The specific complicated weight of love and loss and gratitude, and the quiet knowledge of having been trusted with something that mattered. The 4 words were, "She'll know what to do." She sat with the legal pad in her lap for a long time. The office around her had the worn, particular quality of a space that has been occupied by one person for many years and has arranged itself around their habits. The particular coffee ring on the desk she had always meant to ask him about. The photograph on the wall, not a family photograph, a photograph of the warehouse after the fire in 2003, mid-rebuild, with a group of people in front of it squinting into the sun, and her father in the center of the group with his arm around the shoulder of a man she recognized, looking at the camera with the expression of someone who has had a very hard week and is choosing, in the specific moment, to feel good about what has been done rather than bad about what was lost. That was the thing she had inherited from him that had nothing to do with the legal pad and nothing to do with Gerald Adkins or the Codicil or anything that had happened in the living room on a November morning. She had inherited the capacity to feel good about what had been done rather than bad about what was lost. She had not known she had it until she needed it, which was, she was beginning to understand how the most important things tend to work. She moved back into the house on Birchwood Lane in March. She had the bedroom repainted the color her father had always talked about and never gotten around to. A deep, particular green that he had described once as the color of the garden in May when it was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. She brought the photograph album back to its place on the sideboard. She put the last legal pad on the kitchen table, in the center of it, where she could see it from the window. She planted things in the garden in April, the first spring she had spent in Carver since she was 18. She planted them the way her mother had planted things, with attention, and the specific pleasure of putting something in the ground that intended to grow. She planted tomatoes and basil and a small rose she had been told would take 2 years to do anything worth waiting for, and she decided she was willing to wait. She stood at the kitchen window one evening in May, in the house that was hers in the real and complete way of something you have earned rather than simply received, and she looked at the maple her father had planted the year she was born. It was in full leaf now, the particular dense green of a maple in May, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The thing her father had called proof that something could be beautiful and practical at the same time. She thought about all of it. About a woman who had told her to watch and remember. About a man who had told Gerald Adkins in December that the hardest thing about getting older was that you started to see the things you had been too busy to see before, and that he was grateful for that, even though it was hard. About a USB drive in an apron pocket and a legal pad in a bottom drawer and 4 words written in unsteady handwriting by a hand that had already run out of mornings. She thought about what it meant that the truth had arrived where it belonged, not loudly, not all at once, but in the way that her father had always believed things that were worth building should be built, carefully and from the right materials and with enough time given to each step that it held. She had not done any of it for a reward. She had not sat at that kitchen table with the phone between them calculating a return on what she was about to do. She had done it because her father had asked her to watch and her mother had asked her to remember, and together those 2 instructions had produced in her a person who noticed things and did not put them down when putting them down would have been easier. She had carried what she knew. She had waited for the moment when it was ready to be useful. She had trusted, in the end, that doing the right thing in the right way would be enough. It had been enough. Outside the kitchen window in the May evening, the maple her father had planted was in full leaf and the garden was beginning to come in and the business on Industrial Drive was open and running and the 42 people inside it had come to work that morning under the belief that the place they were coming to was worth coming to. She looked at all of it. She looked at the legal pad on the kitchen table. She looked at the 4 words, which she had read enough times by now to hold them without looking, though she looked anyway. She thought, she'll know what to do. She thought, I did. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.